If I ever disappear, don't look for someone who kidnapped me. Look for the people who smiled after I was gone. Nathan, when you finally read this, our baby will already know the sound of my heartbeat better than the sound of your voice. The note was folded neatly beneath a simple platinum wedding ring resting in the center of a white baby blanket inside the nursery we had spent months decorating together. The room looked perfect. Every shelf was filled with carefully chosen storybooks. Tiny white sneakers waited beside a rocking chair that had never rocked a child to sleep. Soft afternoon sunlight spilled through the curtains, making everything glow exactly the way Evelyn always imagined it would. From the hallway, it looked like the beginning of a beautiful family. Standing in the doorway, I realized it was the end of one. My name is Nathan Crawford. 3 years ago, people called me one of the youngest self-made millionaires in Chicago. Business magazines wanted interviews. Investors wanted meetings. Friends wanted invitations to our lake house. Everyone believed I had built the perfect life. They saw luxury cars, charity galas, private flights, and magazine covers. What they never saw was how quietly someone can disappear long before they actually leave. Evelyn Harper never slammed doors. She never raised her voice. She never threatened divorce. She simply stopped asking me to come home for dinner. She stopped reminding me about doctor's appointments. She stopped telling me when the baby kicked. Somehow, I mistook her silence for peace instead of heartbreak. The nursery still smelled faintly of fresh paint and lavender candles. Her favorite cardigan remained folded over the rocking chair. A half-finished knitting project rested in a basket beside it. Nothing looked abandoned. Everything looked paused, as though she had stepped outside for a minute and would return carrying groceries or smiling with another impossible baby name she wanted me to hear. But Evelyn didn't leave behind a suitcase. She left behind certainty. My phone buzzed again. Vanessa Brooks. Did you find her? She asked the moment I answered. There was concern in her voice, polished and careful, but something about it felt rehearsed. I looked down at the wedding ring still resting on the blanket. No, I whispered. She wouldn't just leave. Vanessa hesitated for barely a second before answering. Maybe she finally realized she deserved a different life. At the time, I thought she was trying to comfort me. Months later, those words would haunt every sleepless night I had left. The security cameras showed Evelyn walking out the front door just after sunrise. She carried one small canvas bag, nothing more. No panic, no rush. No one followed her. She looked over her shoulder only once, toward the upstairs window where the nursery overlooked the driveway. Then she smiled. It wasn't a smile of relief. It wasn't anger either. It looked almost like goodbye. By the time I woke up, she had already vanished into a city of nearly 3 million people, leaving behind a perfectly made bed, untouched breakfast dishes, and one impossible question that no investigator, no attorney, and no amount of money could answer. Why would a woman who spent months preparing for her child's future disappear without taking a single photograph from the walls? Vanessa arrived at the house before sunset, carrying 2 paper bags filled with takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant, as though comfort could be ordered with extra breadsticks and bottled sparkling water. She stepped into the foyer, paused for exactly 1 second when she saw the nursery door standing open, then lowered her eyes with carefully measured sympathy. "Nathan," she said softly, "you have to eat something." I did not answer. I was still standing in the nursery, turning Evelyn's wedding ring over in my hand for what felt like the 1,000th time. It was still warm from my palm, but the woman who had worn it every day for 4 years was gone. Vanessa set the food on the kitchen island and walked slowly toward me. "The police called again," she said. "They still have nothing." Nothing. It was a strange word. 24 hours earlier, I owned companies in 3 states, managed hundreds of employees, and believed almost every problem had a solution if enough money was involved. Now the only thing I wanted could not be purchased. I wanted one answer. Why? Vanessa rested a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Maybe she just needed space," she whispered. "Pregnancy changes people. Stress changes people." I nodded without really hearing her. Something inside the house felt wrong, but I could not explain it. It was not the silence. The house had always been quiet during the day. It was the absence of Evelyn's invisible routines. The coffee machine had not been programmed for 6 o'clock. The windows facing the garden were closed even though she always opened them every morning. Fresh flowers were missing from the dining room table. I had lived inside this house for years without noticing the hundreds of little things she quietly did until every one of them stopped happening at once. Detective Laura Bennett arrived an hour later carrying a slim folder beneath her arm. She was calm, experienced, and refreshingly honest. She did not offer false hope. She sat across from me and asked the same question 3 different ways. Did Evelyn seem afraid of anyone? No. Did she mention leaving? Never. Did she argue with anyone recently? I hesitated. We had disagreements. Mostly about work. I traveled too much. Detective Bennett watched my expression instead of writing notes. Did she have family nearby? Her parents passed away years ago. She has one aunt in Oregon, but they speak only a few times a year. The detective slowly closed her notebook. Mr. Crawford, people rarely disappear without preparing first. Sometimes preparation is emotional instead of financial. Her words settled heavily across the room. Preparation. I looked toward the nursery again. Evelyn had painted tiny stars on the ceiling herself because she wanted our daughter to fall asleep looking at a sky full of possibilities. She had spent weeks choosing books instead of expensive decorations because she believed stories mattered more than furniture. She had planned everything with extraordinary care. Everything except disappearing, or so I believed. As Detective Bennett prepared to leave, she paused beside the front door. One more thing, she said. Your wife emptied her personal safety deposit box 3 weeks ago. I stared at her in disbelief. What was inside? She met my eyes without blinking. That is exactly what we are trying to find out. Across the room, Vanessa quietly lowered her coffee cup. It was only a tiny movement, barely noticeable, but for the first time since Evelyn vanished, I caught something on her face that looked nothing like concern. It disappeared almost instantly, replaced by the same flawless expression of patient compassion. Still, once I had seen it, I could not convince myself that I had imagined it. The detective's final question lingered in the empty house long after she drove away. I walked through each room more slowly than I ever had before, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for me to notice something I had ignored for years. Evelyn had lived here every single day, yet so much of her life had existed quietly beyond my attention. The kitchen calendar still hung beside the refrigerator. Most of the squares were filled with neat blue handwriting. Prenatal appointments, grocery lists, nursery deliveries, a reminder to water the roses every Thursday. Then, exactly 6 weeks before she disappeared, the handwriting changed. The notes became shorter. Fewer hearts decorated the corners. The cheerful little smiley faces she always drew beside important dates vanished completely. I realized I could almost measure the distance between us by looking at the calendar alone. Vanessa insisted on staying another night. She said she was worried about me being alone in such a large house. I appreciated the gesture, or at least I wanted to. She made coffee the way Evelyn never did, too strong and without cinnamon. She folded blankets differently. She opened windows Evelyn always kept closed. They were tiny details, but every difference reminded me that the woman I loved had built a home while someone else was unknowingly trying to replace it piece by piece. That evening I unlocked my office for the first time since Evelyn disappeared. Framed awards covered one wall. Magazine covers lined another. Every achievement I had chased suddenly looked strangely hollow. On the corner of my desk sat an old photograph taken 12 years earlier. Evelyn and I were standing outside a tiny apartment we could barely afford. She wore jeans covered with paint because we had spent the entire weekend repainting the living room ourselves. I was holding a handwritten business plan that consisted of only 4 pages. We looked exhausted, completely broke, and happier than I had remembered. Back then, success meant paying rent on time. It meant sharing one old sedan with 200,000 miles on it. It meant celebrating a new client with hamburgers instead of champagne. Somewhere along the road, I upgraded everything except the promises that had mattered most. My phone buzzed with a message from my executive assistant asking whether I planned to attend the quarterly board meeting. For the first time in over a decade, I ignored it. Another notification appeared only seconds later. It was an automatic reminder from the hospital. Prenatal ultrasound appointment. Thursday, 10 o'clock in the morning. Patient, Evelyn Harper Crawford. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. She had never canceled it. She had simply vanished before the appointment arrived. The next morning, I drove to the medical center anyway. I did not know why. Perhaps I hoped she would walk through the doors carrying that familiar canvas bag and smile at how worried I had become. The receptionist recognized her name immediately. She offered a sympathetic smile before checking the system. "Mrs. Crawford never came in," she said quietly. "But she called a week before the appointment." My heart began pounding. Did she leave a message? The receptionist hesitated before nodding. She asked us to transfer all future records to another physician. She said she would be moving out of state. Out of state. The words echoed through my mind. Evelyn had already made plans while I was busy scheduling investor dinners and business flights. She had spoken calmly to strangers about a future she had never shared with me. As I walked back toward the parking garage, I noticed Vanessa standing beside her car across the street. She smiled and waved as though finding me there was nothing more than a coincidence. Yet something deep inside me whispered that coincidences had become far too common since the morning Evelyn disappeared. Driving home from the medical center, I kept replaying the receptionist's words over and over. Evelyn had arranged a transfer before she ever walked out of our front door. That meant she had not acted on impulse. She had built an exit while I was busy building another business expansion. Every mile back to the house forced me to remember moments that once seemed ordinary, but now felt like warnings I had completely missed. 6 months earlier, Evelyn had asked if I could attend a prenatal class on a Tuesday evening. I told her I had an investor dinner that could not be postponed. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and said she understood. She always understood. A month later, she invited me to hear our daughter's heartbeat during a follow-up appointment. I promised I would be there after one conference call. The meeting ran long. By the time I arrived, the lights in the examination room had already been turned off. Evelyn never complained. She simply thanked the nurse, scheduled the next visit alone, and drove home without me. Looking back, I realized our marriage had not fallen apart through dramatic arguments. It had slowly disappeared beneath hundreds of tiny disappointments that I had convinced myself were necessary sacrifices for success. When I stepped inside the house that afternoon, the silence greeted me again. Vanessa was sitting at the kitchen island reviewing emails on her tablet. She looked up immediately. "Did you learn anything?" she asked. I hesitated before answering. She planned this longer than I ever imagined. Vanessa lowered her eyes and nodded sympathetically. "Maybe that makes it easier," she whispered. Maybe she wanted a fresh start. Her words should have comforted me, yet something about them felt strangely final, almost as though she already knew there would be no reunion. I wandered upstairs and opened Evelyn's closet. Most of her maternity clothes were still hanging neatly in place. Her favorite winter coat remained untouched. The jewelry box still contained family keepsakes she treasured since childhood. If someone truly intended to start an entirely new life, why leave behind the things that mattered most? Then I noticed one empty shelf near the bottom of the closet. It had once held several leather journals she wrote in almost every evening. I had teased her for years about writing everything by hand instead of using a phone. She would always laugh and tell me that paper never ran out of batteries. The journals were gone. She had taken only her thoughts. That discovery unsettled me more than anything else. Detective Laura Bennett returned the following morning with another update. The financial investigation revealed no unusual withdrawals from our shared accounts. Evelyn had not emptied savings. She had not sold jewelry. She had not touched investment funds. Instead, she had quietly used a separate checking account that had received small monthly deposits for almost 3 years. The amount was never large enough for accountants to question, but together it was enough to build a new beginning. I stared at the report in disbelief. "Where did the money come from?" I asked. The detective slid another page across the table. Every deposit had come from royalties connected to the educational books Evelyn had illustrated before our marriage. I had completely forgotten those projects. She had never forgotten them. While I believed I was providing everything our family needed, Evelyn had quietly preserved one piece of independence that belonged only to her. Detective Bennett folded the report and looked directly at me. "Mr. Crawford, sometimes people do not leave because they stop loving someone. Sometimes they leave because they stop believing they are being seen." Her words settled over the room with a weight no amount of money could lift, and for the first time I began wondering whether finding Evelyn would matter if the man she had walked away from no longer deserved to be found. 3 days later, I unlocked the small storage room above the garage because Detective Laura Bennett suggested I search every place Evelyn might have quietly organized before leaving. It was the only room in the house I had not entered in years. Dust covered old moving boxes, holiday decorations, and forgotten pieces of furniture from our first apartment. Near the back wall sat a plain plastic container with a handwritten label in Evelyn's careful script. It simply read, "Baby Memories." My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside were tiny socks, ultrasound photographs, greeting cards from friends, and a stack of sealed envelopes arranged by month. They were not addressed to me. Each envelope carried a simple note. Month 1, Month 2, Month 3. There were enough letters to last almost an entire year after our daughter was born. Evelyn had written to a child she expected might one day grow up without hearing her mother's voice every morning. I carefully opened the first envelope. The paper smelled faintly of lavender. My sweet girl, if you are reading this, it means life did not unfold the way I hoped. I want you to know that you were loved long before you opened your eyes. I counted every kick, every heartbeat, every dream. I hope someone tells you that your mother laughed often, cried quietly, and believed kindness mattered more than winning. I stopped reading because my vision blurred. These were not farewell letters written in panic. They had been created with extraordinary patience. She had planned every word, every memory, every lesson she wanted our daughter to carry through life. Beneath the envelopes rested a small digital voice recorder. Detective Bennett examined it before handing it back to me. She wanted these preserved, she said softly. We should make copies, but you should hear the first recording yourself. I pressed the play button. Evelyn's gentle voice immediately filled the silent room. Today your father missed another appointment. I know he wanted to come. At least I hope he did. One day, if he ever hears this, I hope he understands that disappointment does not arrive all at once. It arrives one empty chair at a time. I lowered the recorder without saying a word. Every sentence sounded calm. There was no anger, no blame, only quiet acceptance. Somehow that hurt far more than accusations ever could have. When I returned downstairs, Vanessa was waiting in the living room. She noticed the recorder in my hand and asked what I had found. I told her only that Evelyn had left personal keepsakes for the baby. Vanessa forced a small smile. That sounds like something she would do, she replied. Then, almost too quickly, she added, at least now you can begin moving forward. Moving forward. The phrase echoed strangely in my mind. Everyone else seemed eager for life to continue. Yet every new discovery revealed that Evelyn had been living with invisible loneliness for months, while I remained completely unaware. Later that evening, Detective Bennett called with another update. Phone records showed that during the final 6 weeks before Evelyn disappeared, she had spoken regularly with one person whose name I did not recognize. There were no text messages, only brief phone calls lasting 2 or 3 minutes at a time. The name on the account was Margaret Ellis. Detective Bennett explained that Margaret was a licensed family counselor in a small town nearly 400 miles away. Evelyn had reached out to a stranger for guidance while I sat only a few feet away at our own dinner table, believing everything was fine. For the first time, I understood that my wife had not disappeared overnight. She had been quietly saying goodbye long before I ever realized she needed someone to ask her to stay. 2 weeks passed without a single confirmed sighting. Every morning began the same way. Detective Laura Bennett called with another careful update, another lead that dissolved into nothing, another reminder that searching for someone who wanted privacy was very different from searching for someone who wanted to be found. I stopped going to the office entirely. Board members held meetings without me. My assistant managed decisions I would once have considered impossible to delegate. None of it mattered anymore. Every room inside the house carried Evelyn's quiet presence, and every empty chair reminded me of another promise I had broken without realizing it. I hired a private investigative firm with offices in 4 different states. Their team reviewed airport security footage, hotel registrations, rental agreements, and public records. I approved every expense without hesitation. Helicopters surveyed remote properties connected to our business network. Digital analysts reconstructed timelines from thousands of electronic transactions. Attorneys contacted agencies that specialized in missing persons. The resources available to a successful businessman were extraordinary. Yet every report reached the same conclusion. Evelyn Harper Crawford had prepared carefully enough to leave almost no trail behind. Detective Bennett visited again near the end of the 2nd week, carrying a slim folder instead of the thick reports I had grown accustomed to seeing. We have something, she said. My heart immediately raced. She opened the folder and slid a photograph across the dining table. It showed Evelyn entering a neighborhood bookstore nearly a month before she disappeared. She was smiling at the cashier while holding a children's picture book beneath one arm. "We interviewed the owner," the detective explained. He remembered her because she spent nearly an hour asking for books about starting over after major life changes. I stared at the image. Evelyn looked peaceful. She did not appear frightened or uncertain. She looked like someone quietly preparing for tomorrow. "Did she say anything else?" I asked. Detective Bennett nodded slowly. "According to the owner, she said something he never forgot. She told him that sometimes the hardest part of leaving is realizing nobody notices you have already been fading." The sentence settled over the room with painful clarity. I remembered evenings when I answered business emails during dinner while Evelyn quietly cleared both plates. I remembered weekends when I promised family time but accepted another conference call instead. None of those moments seemed important when they happened. Together, they had become the story of our marriage. Vanessa continued checking on me almost every day. She brought groceries, organized paperwork, and insisted I needed someone around the house. At first, her kindness seemed thoughtful. Gradually, it began to feel strangely rehearsed. One afternoon, she casually suggested converting the nursery into a home office until everything became normal again. I looked at her in disbelief. "Normal?" I repeated. She quickly apologized, claiming she had chosen the wrong word, but I could not forget how naturally it had come to her. That evening, I walked into the nursery alone and sat beside the rocking chair. The room remained exactly as Evelyn had left it. A tiny stuffed elephant rested inside the crib beside a folded blanket embroidered with our daughter's initials. I picked it up and noticed a small envelope tucked beneath the blanket that I had somehow overlooked before. My name was written across the front in Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting. My hands trembled as I carefully unfolded the single page inside. There was only one sentence. "When you finally start looking for the truth instead of looking for me, you will understand why I had to leave." I read the line again and again until the words no longer sounded like a goodbye. They sounded like the beginning of a mystery I had been too blind to see. And for the first time since Evelyn disappeared, I realized someone else might have known far more about our marriage than I ever did. The sentence Evelyn left behind refused to leave my mind. She had not asked me to find her. She had asked me to find the truth. Those were two completely different journeys. The following morning, I returned to the office for the first time in weeks. Employees greeted me with careful smiles and awkward sympathy, but something felt different. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Doors closed a little too quickly. My executive assistant, Daniel Morris, quietly handed me a stack of reports that had accumulated during my absence. "There is one file you should read first," he said. "It cannot wait." The report came from our internal compliance department. During a routine audit, they had discovered several vendor contracts approved over the previous 18 months that contained unusual consulting fees. The signatures authorizing those payments belonged to Vanessa Brooks. I frowned. Vanessa had always explained those expenses as marketing partnerships connected to our expansion strategy. The amounts were not enormous individually, but together they represented hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why was this never brought to my attention? I asked. Daniel hesitated. "Because every time someone questioned the invoices, you personally approved her recommendations." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. He was right. I had trusted Vanessa without asking enough questions. While I buried myself in meetings and acquisitions, she gradually gained more influence over decisions I barely reviewed. I requested every financial record connected to those contracts. By late afternoon, another pattern emerged. Several companies receiving payments shared the same mailing address. None of them employed more than 2 people. One had already dissolved months earlier. Detective Laura Bennett agreed to review the information even though it extended beyond the original missing person investigation. "Financial deception does not prove involvement in Evelyn's disappearance," she cautioned, "but it does suggest someone was hiding much more than ordinary business mistakes." As investigators expanded their review, I drove home carrying a box of company records. Vanessa was already there, preparing dinner as though nothing had changed. She smiled warmly when she saw me. "You look exhausted," she said. "Did work finally pull you back?" I studied her face for several quiet seconds before answering. It did more than that. Her smile remained, but I noticed her fingers tightened slightly around the kitchen towel she was holding. During dinner, I casually mentioned the compliance audit. Vanessa laughed softly and dismissed it as another unnecessary corporate review. Large companies always find paperwork problems, she said. That is perfectly normal. Her explanation sounded polished, almost practiced. For the first time, I listened not to what she said, but to how carefully she avoided every specific question. Later that evening, Detective Bennett called again. Her voice carried an unusual sense of urgency. Nathan, we interviewed one of the former accounting managers from your company. He resigned almost a year ago. Did he know Vanessa? I asked. Very well, she replied. According to him, Evelyn visited the accounting department several months before she disappeared. She quietly asked whether company procedures allowed executives to approve payments without secondary review. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Did she explain why? No, the detective answered. But he remembers one thing clearly. Before leaving, Evelyn told him she hoped she was wrong because if she was right, the truth would cost someone everything. I remained silent long after the call ended. Suddenly, the missing journals, the hidden savings account, the counselor in another state, and the final letter all seemed connected by an invisible thread. Evelyn had not simply prepared to leave a lonely marriage. She had uncovered something she could no longer ignore. As I looked toward the empty nursery upstairs, another realization settled over me with painful clarity. The greatest mistake I had made was believing my wife had quietly walked away from my life. The truth was that she had been trying to protect it, while I never noticed she was fighting that battle alone. The breakthrough arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a plain white envelope with no return address. It had been delivered through regular mail, addressed only to me in Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting. For several minutes, I simply stared at it, afraid that opening it would somehow make the distance between us even more real. Detective Laura Bennett insisted on examining the envelope first, but there was nothing unusual about it. No fingerprints beyond my own and the postal workers who handled it. No hidden messages. Just a single folded letter written on cream-colored stationery that Evelyn had always kept in the desk drawer beside the nursery. I unfolded the page carefully. Nathan, if this letter has reached you, then I know you have finally stopped asking where I am and started asking why I left. That question matters much more. You spent years believing success could solve every problem. I spent those same years learning that love cannot survive when one person slowly becomes invisible. I waited for conversations that never happened. I waited for dinners that became business calls. I waited for appointments you promised you would attend. I kept believing next week would be different. Eventually, I realized I was raising our daughter inside a marriage that only existed on paper. I paused because I could no longer continue reading aloud. Detective Bennett quietly took the page and finished the final paragraph herself. Do not waste your life trying to bring me back. Spend it becoming the man our daughter deserves to know one day. If that day ever comes, let her meet someone who listens before it is too late. The room remained silent long after the words ended. There was no anger anywhere in the letter. No demands. No legal threats. Only a heartbreaking honesty that left me with nothing to defend. Later that afternoon, Detective Bennett called with another development. The financial investigation had reached its conclusion. Several shell companies connected to Vanessa Brooks had received unauthorized consulting payments over many months. The evidence suggested deliberate deception carried out through carefully disguised invoices. When confronted, Vanessa denied everything and insisted she had simply followed standard procedures. Independent auditors disagreed. Every document pointed back to decisions she had quietly controlled while I approved them without meaningful review. Sitting alone in my office, I finally understood why Evelyn had visited the accounting department months earlier. She had discovered irregularities before anyone else. She had tried to understand them without humiliating me or destroying the company I had spent years building. Instead of accusing me, she investigated quietly. Instead of creating public scandal, she protected innocent employees from uncertainty while searching for the truth herself. Detective Bennett later told me that several staff members remembered Evelyn asking thoughtful questions with remarkable kindness. She never spoke badly about anyone. She simply wanted to understand what had changed inside a company she once believed represented our shared dream. That realization hurt more deeply than any financial loss ever could. Evelyn had continued protecting my future long after I had stopped protecting our marriage. Before leaving the office that evening, I unlocked the nursery one more time. Nothing had moved. The rocking chair still faced the window overlooking the garden. The tiny stuffed elephant remained inside the crib. I carefully placed Evelyn's newest letter beside her wedding ring on the folded baby blanket. They belonged together now, one symbolizing the promises we had made, the other explaining how quietly those promises had been forgotten. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the trees, casting long shadows across the empty room. For the first time since Evelyn vanished, I accepted a painful truth that no amount of money could change. Losing the woman I loved had not begun on the morning she walked out the front door. It had begun years earlier, one overlooked moment after another, until silence became the only language she believed I would ever hear. Nearly 18 months passed before I saw Evelyn again. I was not searching for her that morning. At least that is what I kept telling myself. A charity foundation invited me to speak at the opening of a literacy center in a quiet coastal town almost 500 miles from Chicago. 2 years earlier, I would have sent a representative instead. Now I accepted invitations that reminded me people mattered more than quarterly reports. After the ceremony ended, I walked alone toward the boardwalk overlooking the ocean. Families filled the small park. Children laughed while chasing seagulls across the sand. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon Evelyn had always loved. Then I heard a little girl laugh. Something about it stopped me in my tracks. She could not have been older than 16 months. She had soft brown hair that curled around her ears and bright gray-blue eyes that looked painfully familiar. She stumbled across the grass, holding a small stuffed elephant that looked exactly like the one still sitting in the nursery back home. A woman gently reached down and lifted her into her arms. Evelyn. Time seemed to stand completely still. She looked healthier than I had seen her in years. Her smile was calm. Her shoulders no longer carried the invisible weight I had ignored for so long. She noticed me almost immediately. Surprise crossed her face for only a second before it softened into quiet understanding. Neither of us spoke at first. The little girl looked curiously between us, completely unaware that she was standing in the middle of a story that had changed all 3 of our lives. I slowly walked closer and stopped several feet away. "She is beautiful," I whispered. Evelyn smiled and kissed the top of our daughter's head. "Her name is Lily," she replied. Hearing the name filled my eyes with tears. We had chosen it together during one of the last evenings when we still believed our future would be shared. "I am sorry," I finally said. "I know those words cannot change anything, but they are true." Evelyn looked out toward the waves before answering. "I spent a long time wishing you would say that." Eventually, I stopped needing to hear it. There was no bitterness in her voice, only peace. I asked if I could meet Lily. Evelyn studied my face for a long moment, searching for something that had not existed the last time we stood together. Finally, she carefully lowered Lily onto the grass. The little girl looked at me with innocent curiosity before taking 3 uncertain steps in my direction. She reached out one tiny hand. I knelt until we were at eye level. She touched my face and smiled as though meeting a stranger she somehow already trusted. Tears rolled freely down my cheeks. I had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, but nothing prepared me for the quiet grace of it. Evelyn sat beside us on a nearby bench. "I never wanted revenge," she said softly. "I only wanted our daughter to grow up where she felt seen, heard, and loved every single day." I nodded because there was nothing left to defend. Over the following months, we slowly rebuilt something neither of us expected. Not the marriage we had lost, but a respectful partnership built around Lily's happiness. Trust returned one careful conversation at a time. Whether romance would ever return no longer mattered as much as becoming the parents our daughter deserved. The nursery in Chicago remained exactly as it had always been, except for one small change. Evelyn's wedding ring no longer rested there alone. Beside it sat the final letter she had written, reminding me every day that families rarely fall apart in one dramatic moment. They are shaped, strengthened, or quietly broken by the ordinary choices people make when they believe no one is paying attention.